Thank you, Ritu, and delighted to be back on the stage. Today, to be looking at this incredibly important issue around natural capital and the powerful linkage to people and economies. I think a nice segue from what we've just been hearing there about protein and insects as well. Please join me in welcoming my guest today, who's Brian Kernahan, Chief Sustainability Officer, Manulife Investment Management. Just to provide a little bit of context, biodiversity is being lost faster than at any time in history, damaging the environment, economy, and human health. Meanwhile, people are living longer but not healthier, placing growing risks and stress on healthcare systems. The World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report shows the inextricable links between these existential threats and outlines what it calls interconnected causality, how the climate crisis fuels issues such as ecosystem collapse and resource scarcity. Making a positive change in the landscape will take 4 I's: interconnectedness, investment, insurance, and innovation. The Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity concluded that nature is society's most precious asset and should be at the core of economics. So how can we come to see investments in natural capital as investments in people as well? And I can't think of anybody better at this point to have this conversation on these issues. Brian, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing some of your thoughts. Let me just start off by trying to get a little bit more focused on what exactly is the connection between nature, people, and economics. Could you give us your thoughts there?
Absolutely, and thanks for having me, and appreciate everyone's attention to this important matter. So I'll start with maybe a level set here for a moment, and this notion that nature is being degraded faster than any point in history, as you said. I just want to emphasize that for a moment, and what I'd like to do is, if you'll indulge me, just ask everyone to think about one thing, which is this place on the planet. If you think about where this building is, now think about the building not being here. Now extend that to the broader Bangkok before people, or the city you lived in. Now think about 7.6 billion people on their way to 10 billion people by 2050, and the impact that we as society have had on nature. I think we forget that is the root cause of this degradation, because we absolutely require nature every day. And that too is an issue that I think is easy to forget when we look around and we don't see nature immediately. But I would ask everyone to just continue to think about that as we go, because the other aspect of this that I think is important to start with, and this may be a little provocative for day 2 of a conversation here about net zero and climate change. So we talk about climate change as impacting nature, droughts, floods, etc. But if you actually back up, what we realize is that it was that degradation of nature and our use of it, people's use of nature, that likely has been the cause of climate change. And if we don't start to address the nature loss risk alongside the climate risk, we could very well get to net zero from an emissions perspective. But if you don't satisfy the loss of nature and reverse it, you effectively are for naught, because people's ability to live on this planet, if you will, I'm an optimist, not a doomsdayer, but the fact of the matter is that if we exceed planetary boundaries, it won't do any good that we're not emitting, because nature will have been destroyed. And so I think we have to go back to the root cause, and while climate change is absolutely paramount and we have to get it right, we're suggesting that we also have to get reversing nature loss right, because people depend on it. Our economies depend on it, which I hope we can talk about a little bit more when it comes to what Dasgupta review has said, as you mentioned. But fundamentally, society requires us to get this right alongside nature, alongside climate change.
So let's dive straight into that Dasgupta, or to the Dasgupta findings, and that link between biodiversity and economics, and that economic mechanism that I think you're particularly well positioned to talk about.
Yeah. Well, let me first ask, who's heard of Sir Partha Dasgupta and his review that was authored in 2021? Okay, so a challenge for the climate, or for the pledge wall, read the Dasgupta review. And I'm half joking, but I'm also serious, because what this review did, the UK government issued it, and Sir Dasgupta from University of Cambridge led the authorship of it. And what it basically says is this, which is nature and natural capital, which we can talk more about, is the most precious asset that we and our economies have for life on Earth, period. It also goes on to really highlight that the fact remains that we and therefore our economies are embedded in nature and not external to it. But if you think about the economic theory and you think about economics and the capital markets, we have treated nature as an externality. And what Dasgupta has really put into the mainstream in the language of economics is this notion that that's false. And that goes back to the need to kind of rethink how we look at nature and what we get from nature in the form of economics so that we can reverse nature loss and then, as Manulife likes to think, double down on our investment in nature, whether it's us as an investment manager or investors or shareholders or the corporate boards that many of you, for the companies that many of you work for and are a part of.
So you're talking to the right people when
Yeah.
talking about economics and
Yeah.
externalities and so on. Let's bring the focus on to investment then. Your role, Chief Sustainability Officer at Manulife Investments, and how can asset managers, or what role do you play, do asset managers more broadly play, in addressing this existential sort of nature risk that you've been outlining?
So I would say this is both for us as investment managers, but also for companies and shareholders. Fundamentally, what we need is to invest more in natural capital and invest more in the natural systems that are driving the benefits that society uses. And so what do I mean by that? We're one of the largest institutional managers of natural capital assets, timberland, agriculture, actually the largest today. And so we're investing in nature. That's the easy part to comprehend. Invest in forest, therefore forests remain. Sustainably manage them to produce the products that we see around us. Invest in agriculture directly, that's nature. Grow food, feed the planet. What we also, though, need to do is extend the investing in natural capital to investing in more of the circular economy, right? So we invest in infrastructure. Well, we often think about infrastructure as gray infrastructure, brown infrastructure. What about investing in green infrastructure? Using nature to clean water instead of building a wastewater treatment plant, right? What about, we saw a great example just recently on the real estate business and how you can kind of think about natural capital in the real estate business. So we really think that both corporations, companies, investors, asset managers have an opportunity to really look at nature differently and invest in it. The challenge? Valuing it. The valuation of nature is anemic. We just don't value that which, I hope as I've described, is so important to us. So much like we've seen carbon become valued to address the climate change dilemma, we feel we have to value nature very differently. It's been often said here, what you can manage needs to be measured, or any form of that. We have to be able to measure the value of nature, therefore it becomes investable, and we can actually start to reverse that trend by investing back in nature and not just taking from it.
So tell us a little bit about how you actually go about doing that. How do you value nature in terms of the assets that you've been working with?
Yeah, so there's been a long academic theory of natural capital accounting. Academics have toiled away at it, environmental accountants as they were called 20 years ago. We really believe, as does Dasgupta in their review, that natural capital accounting is what's going to be necessary to in fact put a value on nature, much like we're putting a value on carbon, in order to use the markets, in order to use the economics to drive the investment in reversing nature loss. What does that look like? You know, it essentially means we need better data. We need data that's local. We need data that's multidimensional. We have to start to figure out how you can put not always a value in the sense of trading monetary value, but value nonetheless, so that it can be accounted for in your financials. Much like carbon, you can trade carbon, right? There's a market for it, and you can buy and sell it. But you can also put a carbon price as a company on carbon that is a shadow price or something that allows you to incorporate it into your decision making. So it doesn't have to be a dollar received. It can be a value for nature that you decide is important for the future of whatever it is, your investment or your company. So natural capital accounting, we think, has to occur at the private business level, investor level, but also at the government level, right? Governments, if you looked at the COP 15, that's the biodiversity COP, not the climate COP. If you look at the outcome of COP 15 in Montreal, Kunming, Montreal, the Global Biodiversity Framework was established, setting out countries' commitment to reversing this loss of nature. Now, as part of that, governments need to act. And so we need governments to value nature. Right? This notion of wealth of nature as a metric for a country, right? So if you have GDP, that's great. That's how you drive the economy. But if you have a wealth of nature, you can watch is nature getting better or worse, right? It starts to regulate against the economic indicator that we're so used to and need. And that's another way that governments can use natural capital accounting to take stock of their wealth of nature, much like a company could do the same.
So just on that point of governments valuing nature in that way, you're based in the States, as you're here in Asia. How do you see attitudes towards valuing nature in this part of the world and in other parts of the world in which you operate?
Yeah, so the COP 15 concluded end of 22, I think, and we're still waiting to see major movement by any government, frankly, right? I think U.S. At times, not surprisingly, climate might be the same, is a bit of a lagger. But I think Asia has a great opportunity, and I think Asia, the broader Asia, Southeast Asia, and ASEAN in total has a lot of opportunity today. If you think about the growing economies here, being able to kind of pivot, and you're seeing governments, we heard from the Deputy Minister yesterday, taking this serious to realize that growth in these economies is necessary, but not at the expense of the planet. And I think that's a really great signal. So I think Asia and ASEAN more broadly are really poised to be a leader in this.
Great. Just thinking back to the panel earlier this morning, thinking about non-financial disclosure and reporting and so on. What role is there for natural capital accounting in there, and what's the sort of state of play?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I jump right to the valuation piece as I did here, but it is important to realize that we have to take steps, and disclosure is a really important step to kind of move in this direction. So understanding in very much the same way TCFD has brought disclosure for climate change, the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, is what we believe to be a really important signal. Again, voluntary, but we likely will see it go quasi-regulatory, regulatory, which is fine, because it's forcing companies, investors, corporates to start to understand their dependencies, their risks, their impacts on nature, disclose it, and therefore you start measuring it and you see improvement. So I think that's going to be the way that we start to see this start to take off and ultimately lead to valuation and ultimately lead to investment in natural capital.
Okay, just a final question to get in before we wrap up. I'm just asking about the appetite amongst the investing community for natural assets. It's one thing, and then if you could squeeze in, if people in the room are interested in sort of taking this on board and think about what they can be doing in their own organizations, what would be that one sort of point of practical advice?
Yeah, so I think we're seeing some positive movement in the investment community, institutional investors, which is who we largely work with, but mostly on the real nature assets. Timberland with carbon is a tailwind, right? So you're seeing carbon value forestry more than it has in the past, creating a tailwind, bringing people into that sector. I think agriculture is on its way there as well. So we're seeing it, but it's still in the natural capital asset classes. And as I said earlier, we need to see it elsewhere. So that we have more to do. The one thing that I'll point to, if after you read the Dusk Up to Review and what to do, I would go back to your point about disclosure, right? Look at TNFD. If you're already doing a TCFD, they're melding, they're the same structure. It's probably the easiest to get your head around. Define what your nature impacts look like and dependencies, disclose them, and diagnose what to do next. So if you're going to do one thing, I think it's TNFD just to get started.
Brian, thank you very much for taking us through that. Short and sweet. We are at the end of the session. Time is up. Thanks, Brian, Chief Sustainability Officer, Manulife Investment Management, for those thoughts. Just before we take a break, I'd like to invite you all to respond to the following sentence. Hopefully some of you have done this already, but if not, it should be up on the screen in a moment with the QR code, and you can drop in your responses here. Awareness, I think, is something that we've been doing a little bit just now through our conversation there. But the greatest barrier to fostering sustainability in my organisation is, so please drop your words in there. We'll come back to that a little bit later on this afternoon. Okay, the next panel session will be after lunch. It is lunch now, so we've been talking about appetite amongst investors. I'm sure there's some appetite here, sharpened from all the discussions we've had this morning. Please do enjoy lunch and networking, and please do join me in thanking my guest, Brian, for joining us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.